In the cold, damp cell of the Conciergerie prison, the stench of mildew and decay clung to the walls like the past clung to its lone occupant. Once adorned in silk and diamonds, once bowed to by courtiers and envied by noble women across Europe, Marie Antoinette now sat hunched and hollow-eyed, wrapped in coarse fabric that barely kept out the chill. The journey from the gilded halls of Versailles to this filthy stone prison was not just a fall from power. It was a descent into a personal abyss, and a brutal symbol of a world turned upside down. The French Revolution, which had begun in 1789 with cries of liberty and justice, had now morphed into something darker, more unforgiving. It devoured its own heroes and destroyed those who represented the ancien regime. Marie Antoinette had become more than a queen. She had become a target, a symbol of everything the revolution hated, feared, and sought to erase. Her Austrian birth, lavish lifestyle, and perceived detachment from the common people had earned her the cruel nickname, Madame Deficit. She was blamed for France's financial crisis, accused of draining the national treasury to satisfy her personal whims, and painted as a foreign influence sent to corrupt the soul of France. Reality and rumor had blurred into a single powerful narrative. Now, with the guillotine rising as the most recognizable face of justice, Marie Antoinette was caught in the crosshairs of history. Her life had not always been this way. Born Maria Antonia Josepha Johanna of Austria in 1755, she had been the 15th child of Empress Maria Theresa. Raised in the grandeur of the Habsburg court in Vienna, she had been promised in marriage to the French Dauphin, Louis Auguste, as part of a political alliance. She had arrived in France at just 14 years of age, innocent and unaware of the storm that lay decades ahead. At first, the French people adored her. She was young, beautiful, and full of charm. But as time passed and France's economic problems grew more severe, admiration turned into resentment. Her taste for luxury, expressed through extravagant spending on fashion, jewelry, and parties at Versailles, became the stuff of scandalous pamphlets and political satire. By the time her husband ascended the throne as Louis XVI, the French monarchy was already teetering on the brink. The royal couple's attempts at reform were too little, too late, and often resisted by a conservative nobility. Marie Antoinette, far from being a Machiavellian villain, was largely powerless in political matters, yet the myth of her influence grew. Revolutionary leaders needed scapegoats to explain France's suffering, and she became the most obvious one. The Bastille fell in July 1789, and with it the illusion of untouchable monarchy. By 1791, the royal family's failed attempt to flee the country sealed their fate. The people no longer saw them as protectors but as enemies of the revolution. They were placed under house arrest in the Tuileries Palace, then moved to the Temple prison. There, Marie Antoinette lived with her husband and children under increasingly harsh conditions. After Louis XVI's execution in January 1793, she was alone, a widow in enemy territory. Her son, the Dauphin, was taken from her and subjected to cruel treatment intended to break him both physically and mentally. Her daughter and sister-in-law were kept in separate quarters. The Queen's emotional and spiritual torment deepened as each connection to her former life was severed. On August 1, 1793, she was transferred to the Conciergerie, a medieval prison known as the antechamber to the guillotine. It was a place from which few returned. She was assigned to a tiny cell, monitored around the clock by guards. Her physical health deteriorated rapidly. Years of stress and confinement had already weakened her, and the cold, damp conditions of the prison brought on a persistent cough and fatigue. Food was minimal and tasteless. Sleep was fragmented. Her hair, once luxuriously styled by court attendants, was falling out in strands, and her once radiant complexion had turned pallid and gray. But perhaps the cruelest torment was psychological. Marie Antoinette was isolated, silenced, and vilified. She had no idea of her children's fate. She had no correspondence with friends or allies. Those who might have offered comfort or support had either fled France, been imprisoned, or perished on the scaffold. The Queen who had once dazzled the court at Versailles now sat in silence for hours, staring at the stone walls, reliving memories that seemed to belong to someone else. Every step in the hallway outside her cell could mean the arrival of her executioners. Every meal could be her last. The only routine in her life now was fear. Yet, even in this grim chapter, traces of her regal composure remained. Guards noted her quiet strength and dignity. She did not cry or beg. She thanked those who showed her minor courtesies. She asked for nothing beyond basic needs. There was a strange serenity in her eyes, not because she had accepted her fate with joy, but because there was nothing left to hold on to. She had already lost her husband, her children, her freedom, and her crown. Death was no longer an enemy but a release. Still, she hoped for justice. She believed there would be a trial, and she would have a chance to defend herself. She hoped, naively, that truth might still matter. That she might be allowed to live not as a queen, but as a mother and widow. But the world she knew was gone, and the men who controlled the revolution were not interested in truth. They were interested in spectacle, and Marie Antoinette was the ultimate trophy. The revolutionary leaders, particularly Robespierre and the Committee of Public Safety, viewed her execution as necessary, not only to punish a symbol of tyranny but to solidify their power and terrorize their enemies. The revolutionary press had spent years painting her as a foreign agent, a heartless elite, and a corrupting influence. Some pamphlets even suggested she had plotted with Austria to invade France. Others accused her of poisoning wells, bankrupting the nation, and engaging in depraved sexual acts. Truth was irrelevant. What mattered was rage. In the court of public opinion, Marie Antoinette had already been condemned long before her actual trial began. The streets of Paris pulsed with tension in the autumn of 1793. The reign of terror had begun, and the guillotine was working overtime. Nobles, clergy, moderate revolutionaries, and innocent citizens were being executed daily. Fear gripped everyone. No one was safe. It was in this climate that Marie Antoinette's fate would be sealed. Not in a courtroom of impartial judges, but in a furnace of revolutionary vengeance. Her trial was not about justice. It was about symbolism. About showing the people that the past was truly dead and that the revolution would spare no one, not even queens. The trial of Marie Antoinette began on October 14, 1793, under the gavel of the Revolutionary Tribunal. Though it carried the appearance of a legal proceeding, the outcome was already determined. The charges brought against her were a mixture of fabricated conspiracies and political necessity. The revolutionaries did not need truth. They needed legitimacy for an execution they had long planned. The accusations included collusion with Austria and Prussia to destabilize France, orchestrating counter-revolutionary plots, depleting the national treasury, and perhaps the most grotesque of all, engaging in incestuous acts with her young son, Louis Charles. This final charge shocked even some members of the tribunal, who had grown accustomed to the brutal tenor of the revolution. But sensationalism was not only tolerated, it was encouraged. The goal was not just to condemn a person but to annihilate a legacy. Marie Antoinette sat in the courtroom, pale and physically weakened but composed. Her face had lost its youthful glow. Her once glorious hair, now gray and thin, was tied back in the simplest fashion. She wore a plain white dress, the color of mourning and of execution. The crowds in the gallery did not see a human being. They saw a figure to loathe, a symbol to destroy. Shouts from spectators mixed with jeers, drowning out the voice of her defense attorney, Claude Chauveau-Lagarde, who had been given only a single day to prepare. The defense was restricted at every turn. Witnesses were denied. Testimonies were limited to those approved by the revolutionary government. Lagarde tried to object, to appeal to reason, but was silenced. In the eyes of the tribunal, Marie Antoinette was guilty by virtue of who she was, not what she had done. No amount of pleading could change that. The former queen responded to the accusations with poise. When asked about the charge of incest, she responded not with fury but with sorrow. She said that nature itself would reject such a crime, and then turned to the mothers in the gallery, asking them if they believed her capable of such an act. Her answer silenced the courtroom for a moment. Even the most hardened of her enemies felt a flicker of discomfort. But it was only a flicker. The machinery of the trial moved forward. The prosecution presented letters, conversations, and decisions from her past, twisting each detail into a damning piece of evidence. No voice of dissent was allowed. The truth, in that room, was a casualty of politics. The tribunal reached its verdict on October 15, only 2 days after the trial had begun. Marie Antoinette was declared guilty of all charges. The sentence: death by guillotine. Her face did not betray surprise. She nodded once, slowly, as though she had known all along. She was returned to her cell, where she would await execution in silence. The guards who accompanied her later reported that she did not cry or collapse. She thanked them with a whisper, sat down on her cot, and began to write what would be her final letter. It was addressed to Madame Elisabeth, her sister-in-law. In it, she expressed her sorrow for her children, her forgiveness for those who wronged her, and her faith in God. She asked Elisabeth to care for what remained of her family and to raise the children with honor. It was the letter of a woman who had already made peace with death, who had nothing more to fear and little more to lose. The night was long. Outside the prison, the scaffold was being prepared. The streets buzzed with whispers and anticipation. Paris, drunk on revolution, awaited the final act. Inside her cell, Marie Antoinette slept only in brief fits. She prayed quietly. She stared at the flickering candle and thought of her husband, her children, her home in Vienna. She remembered music, laughter, gardens, and fountains. She remembered the ballroom at Versailles, the cheers of courtiers, and the glow of chandeliers. All of it now felt like a distant dream. Her world had vanished. In its place was only this: a stone wall, iron bars, a straw bed, and the silence of finality. At dawn, she rose with trembling hands. Her breakfast, bread and weak chocolate, went mostly untouched. Her mouth was dry, her fingers shook. Yet when the guards entered to prepare her for execution, she stood without resistance. Her hair was cut short to ensure the blade would not catch. Her hands were bound tightly behind her back. The rope left marks on her wrists. She was led from the Conciergerie into the waiting tumbril, a wooden cart normally used for trash and criminals. There would be no special treatment, no dignity of title or farewell. The cart moved slowly through the streets of Paris, followed by guards and surrounded by a sea of onlookers. Crowds leaned from windows. Children were hoisted on shoulders. Some threw insults. Others simply watched, curious. Marie Antoinette did not shout. She did not cry. She sat silently, her back straight, her head held high, though her face was pale with fear and fatigue. She passed by landmarks she once knew intimately. Places where she had once danced and dined, now reduced to cold stone in her memory. The people lining the streets had waited for this moment for years. To them, her death represented justice, vengeance, and freedom. As the cart approached the Place de la Révolution, where the scaffold loomed, Marie Antoinette closed her eyes. The blade of the guillotine gleamed in the sunlight. It was the same place her husband had been executed. The wooden steps groaned as she climbed them. Her hands were untied at the top. She nearly stumbled, but caught herself. One of the guards stepped forward to help, and she quietly apologized for stepping on his foot, a final act of civility in a world gone savage. She turned to the crowd but said nothing. The executioner gave the signal. She was strapped to the board, face down, her neck aligned beneath the blade. A hush fell over the square. The blade fell. It was October 16, 1793. The crowd erupted. Some cheered. Others wept. A few stood silently, unsure what had just happened. The head of the queen, once adorned with crowns and pearls, now rested in a basket. The revolution had claimed another victim. But in that moment, something changed. The execution, meant to mark a final victory, left behind an uneasy stillness. The spectacle had succeeded. The queen was dead. Yet, the questions lingered. Had justice truly been served, or had the revolution consumed its own soul? As the sun set on October 16, 1793, and the body of Marie Antoinette was taken away for burial in an unmarked grave at the Madeleine Cemetery, a chilling quiet fell over the crowd that had just moments before roared in triumph. The deed was done. The symbol of monarchy, privilege, and foreign influence had been eliminated. The guillotine had claimed its most prestigious victim to date. Yet for all the noise and excitement, a strange void followed her death. What had been achieved? The Queen was gone, but France remained a nation deeply wounded. The economy was still in crisis. Bread lines were still long. The revolutionary government still ruled by fear. And the people, though briefly satisfied, quickly returned to the grim reality of survival in a nation governed by terror. The reign of terror did not slow down after Marie Antoinette's execution. In fact, it intensified. The precedent had been set. If a queen could fall, anyone could. Thousands more would follow her to the scaffold. Nobles, clergy, peasants, former allies of the revolution, and even those who had once been hailed as heroes of liberty. Maximilien Robespierre, the architect of this brutal system, insisted that terror was necessary to preserve the revolution's ideals. He proclaimed that virtue, without terror, was powerless. Under his direction, the Committee of Public Safety expanded its control, rooting out supposed enemies with ruthless efficiency. Accusations were often based on little more than rumors or personal grudges. Trials were swift and cruel, with death sentences issued after token hearings. Paris became a city haunted by the rattle of tumbrils and the echo of falling blades. In the midst of this storm, Marie Antoinette's legacy began to evolve. While she had been reviled in life as a frivolous, detached monarch, her death humanized her in the eyes of many. Even some revolutionaries who had once celebrated her downfall began to express unease. The image of the once regal queen walking stoically to her death, silent and broken yet composed, began to soften public perception. Those who had once accused her of arrogance now remembered her dignity. The pamphlets that had painted her as a monster seemed less convincing. The grotesque allegations used to justify her execution began to look more like propaganda than justice. A whisper began to circulate among the people of Paris, not loud enough to challenge the revolution, but strong enough to plant seeds of doubt. Had they gone too far? Her family, what remained of it, continued to suffer. Her daughter, Marie Therese, was eventually released from prison but had been deeply traumatized by her confinement and the loss of nearly everyone she loved. Her young son, Louis Charles, was kept in solitary confinement, abused, neglected, and subjected to psychological torment. He died in prison at the age of 10, broken in body and mind. These further tragedies added weight to the public's growing guilt. The once proud nation that had promised liberty and equality now found itself surrounded by blood, betrayal, and silence. Beyond France, the execution of Marie Antoinette sent shockwaves throughout Europe. Monarchs were horrified. If a queen could be guillotined by her own people, what safety existed for royalty anywhere? The Austrian court, her family by blood, was enraged and heartbroken. Her brother, Emperor Leopold II, had tried to protect her through diplomatic means, but his efforts had failed. Now the news of his sister's death galvanized European monarchies to action. Coalitions were formed, armies were mobilized, and the wars that followed would rage across the continent for years. Her death became a rallying cry, not just for monarchists but for those who opposed the idea that revolution could justify any means. Marie Antoinette, who had been dismissed as a foreign troublemaker, was now mourned as a martyr by those who viewed the French Revolution with horror. Inside France, the revolution continued to devour its own. Georges Danton, once a prominent leader, was executed. So was Camille Desmoulins, a key voice of the early revolution. Eventually, even Robespierre would fall, his own head claimed by the very instrument of justice he had so passionately defended. The terror ended not with a dramatic conclusion but with a whimper, a quiet unraveling as exhaustion and revulsion overtook fear. The French people had grown tired of blood. The revolution, once so full of hope, had become a nightmare. When the Bourbon monarchy was restored years later under Louis XVIII, efforts were made to reclaim the remains of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. In 1815, their bodies were exhumed from the Madeleine Cemetery and reburied in the Basilica of Saint-Denis, the traditional resting place of French kings and queens. A proper ceremony was held. Statues were erected. A solemn attempt was made to restore their dignity in death that had been so brutally stripped from them in life. Yet the France they had once ruled was no more. The revolution had changed everything. The monarchy that returned was no longer absolute. The people had tasted rebellion, and the future would never again belong solely to kings and queens. Still, the story of Marie Antoinette endures, not only as a tale of power lost but as a reflection of human vulnerability. Her life and death illuminate the dangers of propaganda, the fragility of status, and the ease with which a society can turn against its own. She was not a saint, nor was she the villain that revolutionary pamphlets claimed. She was a woman born into immense privilege, shaped by her time, and ultimately destroyed by forces beyond her control. She was a wife who loved her husband, a mother who lost her children, and a human being who faced the end with dignity. Today, her legacy is viewed through a more nuanced lens. Historians continue to debate her political influence, her character, and her role in France's decline. Some argue she was misunderstood, scapegoated by those who needed someone to blame. Others maintain that her extravagance symbolized a monarchy disconnected from the realities of its people. But nearly all agree that her final months were marked by suffering, and her execution was more about politics than justice. Her life, once a fairy tale, became a tragedy. And in that tragedy lies her enduring power. In the years following Marie Antoinette's execution, the streets of Paris, once stained with the blood of the revolution, settled into a weary silence. The guillotine had claimed thousands, but none had left a mark as complex and haunting as the fallen queen. Her story did not end with the blade. It lived on in whispers, memories, and changing narratives. Artists, poets, playwrights, and political thinkers began to revisit her legacy, often transforming her into a symbol of grace in the face of cruelty. The tragic queen, no longer a reviled foreigner in the eyes of many, became a powerful representation of innocence overwhelmed by radical ideology and a cautionary tale about the dangers of unchecked power. For all her flaws, her extravagance, her aloofness, her misjudgments, Marie Antoinette's suffering and death sparked a re-evaluation of the revolution's cost. In the courts of Europe, particularly in Austria, her homeland, Marie Antoinette was memorialized with sorrow and honor. Monuments were erected. Her correspondence was published and studied. Royalists across the continent elevated her to martyrdom, seeing in her downfall the brutal injustice of mob rule. In France, however, her memory remained complicated. Though the monarchy was restored briefly, it never returned to its absolute roots. The revolution had fundamentally changed the soul of the nation. Power was now viewed with suspicion. Authority had to justify itself before the people. And while some continued to condemn her memory, others saw in her the embodiment of a tragic turning point, a moment when revolution lost its humanity. Marie Antoinette's transformation from queen to prisoner had happened in stages, each more humiliating than the last. But what remained remarkable throughout her ordeal was her composure. Testimonies from guards, prison officials, and even hostile witnesses described a woman who carried herself with quiet strength. They observed how she rarely complained, how she thanked even the guards tasked with watching her like an animal. This dignity stood in stark contrast to the way she was portrayed in revolutionary propaganda. The pamphlets had dehumanized her, calling her l'Autrichienne, a play on words meaning both the Austrian woman and the Austrian bitch, accusing her of every imaginable vice. But the woman who faced the tribunal, and later the executioner, was not the monster of pamphlets. She was something far more powerful, a real human being enduring real pain. One of the most poignant elements of Marie Antoinette's story is her isolation. From the moment she entered the Conciergerie prison, she was cut off from the world she had known. Her husband was dead. Her children were torn away. Her sister-in-law, Madame Elisabeth, was held in another part of the prison. Friends were gone, either executed or exiled. Letters were intercepted or never delivered. News was rare and often filtered through hostile hands. She had no idea what was happening beyond her cell. This psychological torment added another layer to her suffering. She had not just lost her freedom. She had been erased, reduced to a figure of scorn. And yet, through all of this, she remained silent and resolute. The few items she possessed in prison were pitiful. A straw mattress, a chipped tin cup, a worn shawl. The grandeur of Versailles, the sparkle of diamonds, the perfume of gilded halls, all of it had faded into memory. What remained was a woman stripped bare, not only of her titles but of her very identity. She was no longer queen or mother or wife in any real sense. She was prisoner number 280. And still, in that barren room, something of her former self remained. Not the queen in silk, but the soul that refused to shatter. Her final letter, written in shaky handwriting, was a testament to this. In it, she spoke of faith, of forgiveness, and of sorrow, not bitterness. She asked God to forgive her enemies and entrusted her children to his care. There was no plea for rescue, no lament of injustice. Only quiet resolve. The trial had lasted only 2 days, but its impact would echo for generations. It revealed how revolutionary justice had become a weapon of fear, not fairness. Witnesses were coerced, evidence was twisted, and defense was merely symbolic. The courtroom was a stage, and the verdict was theater. The crowd, hungry for vengeance, cared little for truth. They wanted a queen's head, and they got it. But the spectacle of her death lingered. For many, it marked a point of no return. The revolution, which had once inspired hope across the world, had crossed into something darker. The ideals of liberty, equality, and fraternity had been drowned in blood. After her death, whispers of remorse grew. People who had once shouted for her execution began to wonder if the revolution had lost its way. The guillotine, once celebrated, became a symbol of tyranny. Streets that had cheered her demise now spoke in hushed tones about her courage. Rumors spread of guards who had wept, of citizens who had turned away in shame as the blade fell. Even in death, Marie Antoinette had reclaimed her humanity. Over time, historians would delve into the contradictions of her life. Some would focus on her early years in France, her frivolity, her parties, the political naivety that had alienated the people. Others would explore the final months, her imprisonment, her silence, her dignity. They would uncover letters, journals, and court records. And with each discovery, the image of Marie Antoinette became more complex. Not a saint, not a villain, but a woman caught in history's storm. The Conciergerie, once a place of suffering, was later turned into a museum. Tourists now walk through the narrow corridors where she once paced. Her cell has been preserved as a testament to that chapter in history. A plaque bears her name. Candles are lit. Flowers are left. The walls, once witness to her fear and loneliness, now speak to visitors of fragility and fate. The past has not been forgotten. And neither has she. Her story endures because it touches something universal. The fall from power, the price of privilege, the struggle to maintain dignity in the face of destruction. In Marie Antoinette's final hours, we see not only the end of a queen but the measure of a woman. We see a life that began in opulence and ended in silence. A life that reminds us how fragile power is. How easily the crowd turns. How dangerous hate can be when fueled by fear. And how, even in the darkest moment, grace can survive. In the centuries since Marie Antoinette's death, her story has continued to provoke debate, emotion, and re-examination. She has been reborn in literature, cinema, art, and historical studies not just as a symbol of royal decadence or revolutionary justice, but as a complex figure whose life reflected the violent transformation of an era. From the moment she set foot in France as a teenage bride, her life became a mirror of France's own fate, a nation torn between tradition and revolution, privilege and justice, appearance and reality. Her youth was marked by splendor and obliviousness, her adulthood by fear and isolation, and her final months, by suffering that few could have predicted when she first danced through the halls of Versailles in a gown woven from diamonds and silk. Marie Antoinette's life challenges easy moral judgments. She was certainly a queen who lived extravagantly while her subjects starved. But she was also a foreign teenager married into a rigid and alien court, given little political training and surrounded by scheming factions. She was accused of treason, but much of the evidence against her was fabricated or distorted. She was portrayed as a heartless libertine, yet accounts from friends, children, and even jailers suggest she was deeply devoted to her family and capable of empathy. She was hated by the public, but that hatred was carefully cultivated through political propaganda meant to direct national frustration at a singular scapegoat. In her downfall, we see not only the death of a monarch but the full cost of revolutionary zeal. In her last days, Marie Antoinette became something far more than the Queen of France. She became a human face on the revolution's cruelty. She represented how far things had gone, how much had been lost. Her final journey from Versailles to the Conciergerie, from throne to prison, was not just personal, it was symbolic. It showed how revolutions, once they become instruments of vengeance, can abandon their ideals. The French Revolution began with calls for equality, liberty, and fraternity. But by 1793, those ideals had drowned in blood. The executions, the fear, the betrayals, the paranoia, these became the true legacy of the terror. Marie Antoinette's execution was one of its darkest chapters. But it is also in this darkness that her final acts gained their weight. Her refusal to break, her quiet acceptance of fate, her dignity under constant surveillance, and her unwavering care for her children, all these revealed something more lasting than the rage that had consumed France. They revealed character. In the end, she was no longer the queen of jewels and parties, but a woman stripped of every luxury, facing the same death that thousands of her subjects had already suffered. Her transformation from monarch to martyr was not one of words, but of actions. She faced her end not with royal arrogance, but with quiet resolve. History is not kind to the figures it simplifies. Marie Antoinette is often remembered for saying, "Let them eat cake," though she never uttered those words. She's remembered for towering hairstyles, lavish gowns, and gambling nights. But what endures far longer than these caricatures is the truth behind the final months of her life. The endless nights alone, the constant surveillance, the humiliation, the mock trial, and the gallows waiting in the morning mist. That truth tells us more about who she was and the world she lived in than any anecdote from Versailles. Her daughter, Marie Therese, the only member of the royal family to survive the revolution, lived into adulthood. Though her life was deeply scarred by trauma and grief, she carried forward her mother's memory. In letters, memoirs, and interviews, she spoke of Marie Antoinette not as a queen, but as a mother who had been brave and loving until the very end. The pain she described spoke volumes about the human cost of that time. A cost paid not just by kings and queens, but by an entire nation fractured by war, famine, fear, and violence. The site of her execution, the Place de la Révolution, has long since changed. The guillotine is gone. The square has been renamed. Traffic now flows where thousands once stood to watch heads fall. But the story lingers. Tour guides point out the spot where she died. Visitors still pause at the Basilica of Saint Denis to see the tomb where her remains rest beside her husband's. And in the museums of France, portraits of Marie Antoinette hang once more, not as symbols of scorn, but as windows into an era when the world changed forever. Marie Antoinette remains one of the most iconic figures in French history because her life contains all the contradictions of the age in which she lived. She was both cause and casualty, participant and victim. Her fate was not simply the result of who she was, but what she represented. And in this, perhaps, lies her greatest legacy, a reminder that symbols are powerful, and when misused, they can lead a people not to justice, but to cruelty. To remember Marie Antoinette is to reflect on the revolution itself, not just its goals or heroes, but its failures, its betrayals, and its irreversible choices. Her death, far from being the triumph her enemies imagined, became a moment of reckoning. A flash of humanity in a time of horror. Her silence on the scaffold spoke louder than 1,000 speeches. Her fall from grace, more than just the end of a dynasty, became a mirror for the world to see the price of politics without mercy. Even today, centuries later, she captures imagination and empathy in equal measure. Was she naive? Yes. Detached? Often. But also courageous, wronged, and ultimately dignified in the face of death. She was not perfect, but she was real, and that is what endures. You've just witnessed one of the darkest punishments in history. But many more still lurk in the shadows. So if you dare, subscribe to Torture Vault, where every scream from the past still echoes.